Hi, my name is Tom McCluskey, and welcome to Capitol Hill 101, the legislative program for the March for Life Education and Defense Fund to try to humanize the lobbying process, to make it easier and more accessible for you to contact your members of Congress and your state legislators and their staff and able to lobby for the cause of life. There's a lot of anger today in politics, from the Occupy Wall Street folks to the Tea Party folks. And it's justifiable anger, except anger doesn't get you listened to. Civility does. And that's what we try to teach here. That's how real change happens. People remember Martin Luther King more than they remember Malcolm X. They remember Frederick Douglass more than they remember John Brown. And that's the type of atmosphere that we try to build with Capitol Hill 101. Today, you'll be hearing from experts, both activists, March for Life staff, as well as elected officials, on how best to lobby. So I hope you enjoy the program, and I hope to see you at the March for Life.
Welcome to our first interview of Capitol Hill 101. I'm Mackenzie Ng with the March for Life, and I'm joined here today by Rachel Bovard. Rachel is Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute, a fellow at Defense Priorities, and a senior advisor to the Internet Accountability Project. She also co-authors a book called Conservative: Knowing What to Keep. Now, Rachel is a Capitol Hill expert, but today she'll be helping us really break down the legislative process and remove some of the mystery surrounding grassroots advocacy and lobbying, two things that often seem daunting but are ultimately so important to understand as pro-life Americans. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So we get a lot of questions surrounding advocacy and lobbying and all of these scarier terms for people. So I have a couple questions here that we're just going to work through. So to lay the groundwork for a conversation, let's start with the basics of how a bill becomes a law. Can you just sort of walk us through the layman's terms there?
Sure. So the most basic way a bill becomes a law is, right, it starts in the House, it goes to the Senate, passes both chambers, the president signs it. Now, you can reverse it. It can start in the Senate and then go to the House, and then the president signs it. And there are all kinds of variations in between. What happens when, for instance, the House and Senate pass two different versions of the same bill? They'll meet in what's called a conference committee, reconcile their differences, then pass that final package, and then the president signs that. The chambers can also sort of ping pong bills back and forth to each other. You know, you pass mine, no, pass mine. But ultimately, you have to pass both chambers, the House and the Senate, before the president signs the bill, and then you have a law.
Nice and easy. So when it comes to any legislation, pro-life legislation, I think a lot of people, definitely in our generation, but probably across all generations, are unsure as to how they can actually affect this process. So let's start there. Can someone like me, an ordinary constituent, actually affect this process?
Yes, people's voices matter very much to legislative outcomes. And what I mean by that is, especially in the district or state that you live in, talking to your elected representatives is so important, because these conversations, these comments, the phone calls you make are all tracked in every single office. So if you email your congressman, for instance, and say, hey, I really want you to vote for this pro-life bill or co-sponsor, this pro-life amendment, that gets logged into a system. The congressman will see how many people and who wrote in about what, and same with phone calls. A number of calls on the same topic definitely matter, in congressional offices, in Senate offices as well. So those things are tracked. It doesn't just go into the abyss. Someone is paying attention. So those comments, meetings, emails, all matter.
Yeah, I think that's important to know. And a lot of times we call this sort of act of reaching out to your legislators, your lawmakers, lobbying. And that's a word that I think makes a lot of people cringe, or, it's a little opaque even. So there's a couple different kinds of lobbying, but what does lobbying mean, and what does it look like for the average person?
So when we talk about the phrase lobbying, right, I think the pejorative reference is toward sort of the moneyed interests, right? Companies hiring people to petition the government, for their specific, tax provisions or whatever. I'm going to set that aside for a moment and talk about the fact that, individual constituents reaching out to their elected representatives isn't lobbying in the traditional sense. This is a constitutionally protected right to petition your government, to say, you represent me, and this is what I would like you to do. That is a foundational concept to the American government, and one that every citizen has a right to do. And so, when we talk about lobbying in the sense of, we're really just saying, talk to your member, right? Talk to the person who represents you, because they're trying to make decisions on behalf of you. You gave them the job. You voted them into office. And so what you have to say matters. And so whether it's meetings, right, in the state or here in DC, letters, emails, phone calls, all of that, we can call it lobbying, but it really is just the American people talking to the people who represent them. And that is, again, what our self-government is based on.
So we do this, we send emails, we send tweets, we make phone calls. I don't know if you have any personal anecdotes of how those words aren't falling on deaf ears. We send thousands and thousands of emails, even at the March for Life, we do this. How can people know that they're not just hitting send on an email that's falling, you said, into an abyss? Do you have any sort of stories about ways that that's really worked, proof that it's working?
Well, I can tell you, so my very first job on Capitol Hill was something called a Legislative Correspondent. So there is a person in every office that gets all of this mail and is tasked with sort of deciding, responding to it, categorizing it, giving the information to the senior staff, to the member of Congress about what people are writing in about and what they're saying. And occasionally the member of Congress will go through the letters themselves and say, I want to see what people are saying. So it isn't just an abyss. There is actually a person going through this mail, and that person was me for my very first job. And I will say this, a lot of times, and March for Life probably does this as well, they'll construct sort of an archetype of what the email should look like, what the phone call should say. And those are good because, you have your representatives in DC, groups that are saying, this is exactly what, needs to happen legislatively. And that's really helpful because sometimes, regular Americans don't have time to pay attention to the ins and outs of what's going on. But to the extent that people can take those messages and personalize them, right, and make them their own. You may decide that you want this pro-life priority for a very personal reason, or because you believe very, strongly in the sanctity of life, and this is why. Those personal notes, I think, really, really do make a difference. Because again, members of Congress and senators really do pay attention. They do pay attention to the voters that sent them to office, and they really do value, I think, that personal communication, however it comes, phone call, email, letter, meeting. So to the extent that you can personalize those things, I always say do that.
Yeah, and these days, you get an email that says, we do this at the March for Life Action, where we say, this issue is coming down the bill. Here's what this means for you. Here's what this means for, pro-life issues. Here is a pre-written email for you to send to your legislator. There is always a room for you to edit the email, write in your stories, and we encourage people to do that. And I think that that's what people need to know, is that their personal stories will work. And so this is all great. We've covered sort of why we shouldn't be scared to lobby, why it's not this big daunting thing. But now that we're mentally ready to go, where do we start? What's the best practices, really?
So start with your home district, right? You're represented by a member of Congress in the House, and you're represented statewide by a senator. Know who those people are is step one. And then, we oftentimes, I think we can't reach these people, right? That they're sort of far outside of where we are. And yeah, if you don't live in Washington, D.C., this is where a lot of these people spend their time, but they also are home. And a lot of these members of Congress in particular have office hours in their district or in their state. And so if you don't want to make the trek to D.C., you can always meet with them in person in their district office. And that's just a matter of scheduling, a time to do that. And I encourage people to do that because, again, written communication is always helpful. Phone calls are always helpful. But to the extent that you can actually have a personal relationship with the person who has the job of representing you, why wouldn't you? Right? That's a great first step. But, also letters, phone calls, emails never go unnoticed, especially in volume. Right? I think sometimes people get so insulated in DC that they can convince themselves that an issue that people in DC aren't caring about doesn't matter at home. But oftentimes that's not the case. And so, if there's, as opposed to like 2 letters, if there's 15, right, that's actually going to surprise people and move the needle. So all of that does matter. But I would say never think you can't meet with these folks because, they work for you.
Yeah. I guess we should talk about, right now we're in a pandemic, and so meeting with them in person might not be the easiest. I know that we've seen virtual advocacy skyrocketing during this time. Do you see the future of advocacy sort of going in that direction?
I do. I think we've realized how much we can do virtually. In my mind, it never takes the place of in-person meetings. I think those are always going to be important when it is in fact safe to do it. Mm-hmm. But in this time, and I do think going forward, there's going to be a very significant virtual element. And a lot of members will do, even before the pandemic, we're doing, virtual town halls or, teletown halls. And, if you sign up for the notifications from your, representative or senator, you'll get alerts for when those happen. Sometimes they'll do them on Facebook or social media. Always participate, right? See if you can get in the queue to ask a question. That's a very easy way to sort of get to your congressman or your senator without having to actually go through the process of scheduling a meeting. So right. There are a number of ways, I think, to impact this process and make your voice heard that are what we would previously have called non-traditional, but are now sort of how we live.
Right, yeah, where my mom used to take us when we came for the March for Life directly to our Pennsylvania offices to talk. I'm a little more introverted. I might be more prone to tweeting or to, making a call or something like that. So I think it's really great to know that everyone has different options for maybe what they feel more comfortable with.
That's
so
right.
This is all really helpful. I think our last question then is just, you're super involved on Capitol Hill, politically minded. What's the biggest piece of advice that you can give to young people about getting involved politically?
Don't be scared. It's step number one. But number two, just pay attention. This is your government, right? This is your government. They work for you. You have an ability to influence the outcome. So whether that's, participating in teletown halls or, watching what's happening in the House and Senate floor or just signing up for emails from the people who work for you in Congress, get a sense for what's going on, get a sense for how the issues that you're interested in. And then I think the last thing I would say for the younger generation, the advent of social media, which I didn't grow up with, but we now live in this era, don't be rude to people on social media. That's the biggest way to get ignored.
Or blocked.
is to attack people or your member of Congress on social media. We can disagree respectfully, and we can agree, and we can encourage. And so those are two things I think we should always be comfortable expressing is polite disagreement, but also encouragement when people do things you agree with.
Great. Well, thank you so much for being with us today. I think everyone could learn a lot from Rachel. You probably want to go follow her on Twitter at Rachel Bovard. So this has been a wonderful first segment. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right.
Hello, I'm Anne-Claire Levy with the March for Life, and I'm joined today by Jamie Dangers, the Legislative Director for Susan B. Anthony List. In this role, she serves as the link between Susan B. Anthony List and congressional staff in both the U.S. House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate, and is responsible for lobbying activities to implement the organization's federal legislative goals. Welcome, Jamie. Now that we've covered the basics of pro-life lobbying, let's dive into the tools available to you both in person and online, in order to make your voice heard on Capitol Hill.
Thanks so much for having me. I know that talking with members of Congress or their staff can be intimidating, but it is so important. It is crucial for pro-life Americans to have their message heard loud and clear on the Hill. And it's really easy to do. When you're a constituent, you are a member's priority. So I would say if you're looking for a meeting on the Hill, look up their website, find the phone number, whether it's in their district office, which might be close to where you live as a constituent, or their DC office, and just call and ask who handles the pro-life issue for the congressman. That's the first step.
So Jamie, I was so excited when you agreed to come on for Capitol Hill 101, just because you have such a unique view of life on Capitol Hill. You worked for years as a staffer, and now you yourself help with lobbying efforts. And so you just have that perspective of both sides of the coin, which I'm excited to dive into today. So in your introduction, you were mentioning some tips for getting in contact with your member or their staff. You were talking about going onto their website. Now, are there other ways that you can get in contact? Can we dive a little bit into that?
Absolutely. When I worked as a staffer on the Hill, we would get calls all day, every day from constituents calling whether they were excited about what was going on or whether they were upset about what was going on. But calling is definitely a good way of reaching your member and their staff. You can leave a message, or you could even ask to talk to the staffer who handles the pro-life issue if you want to have a real conversation, a real discussion, not just leaving a message. Usually, members of Congress have ways you can email them as well. On their website, that'll be listed. You can also interact with them on social media. There's a lot of interaction these days that happens that way. And especially when in person, things are a little harder these days. Virtual communication has become, I think, even more important. So whether an in-person meeting is or is not possible, the social media and email and phone call ways of getting in contact with your member are also very important.
Mm-hmm. I love that you mentioned social media. As the social media manager at the March for Life, I spend my entire day on Twitter. And so it's always great to hear that your voice can be heard using tools that might seem as unique as Twitter or as almost even trivial. But to be able to contact your representative in all of these different ways, it's heartening to hear that your voice can be heard. So now that we've discussed different ways to secure a meeting with your member or their staff, let's dive into the best ways to prepare for your meeting. I'm sure a lot of people who have, secured that time slot just want to be able to present their message as articulately as possible, make sure that they're going to get their passion across to their member of Congress. So what are some best tips that they can go over in preparing to meet with their representative?
In DC, things happen very quickly. So if you're going to have a meeting, you should know it's probably not going to be a long one. And that's not an insult. That's just because they're fitting 20 meetings into their day. So if you get 15 or 20 minutes of their time, that's fantastic. So when you're preparing, think short, think snappy. Make sure you have honed in on exactly what you're asking of them. I'm sure that you have a million different things you'd love to discuss with the staffer or the member, but try to figure out what are the one or two things that this member should hear from you. And one way to figure that out is by knowing more about the member, him or herself. So try to figure out from their website, from their social media, what interests them. What are the topics that really they have deep convictions about? What are the things that you have in common with them? If you can find those things, you can have a fruitful conversation by just finding those areas of commonality and reaching them that way. I would also say if you have a particular ask for them, make it early and maybe have it in writing as well. If you have a handout laying out your idea or the name of the bill that you want them to co-sponsor or the amicus brief that you want them to sign on, whatever your particular issue is, if you have it in writing, you can leave that with the staffer and they won't forget as soon as you walk out the door.
Oh, wonderful advice. So we also get a lot of questions from, our pro-life lobbyists, our advocates, asking, okay, I've met with my representative, but I don't really know if I've gotten my message across. I feel like the relationship kind of just ends after the meeting. So as someone who has worked on Capitol Hill, what advice do you have to people who want to get more involved, who want to make their voices heard? How can they continue to foster a relationship with their member to make sure that they understand just how convicted they are to this issue?
Members of Congress are pulled in so many different directions all the time, and they are hearing from people who have vastly different beliefs. So when you're trying to get your voice heard, I think just try to remember to encourage the member whenever there is opportunity to do so. The staff and the member hear from people who are angry more often than they hear from people who are happy. And maybe your issue is one you're angry about, maybe it's one you're happy about, depends on the member, depends on the time. But if there is something you can say, you know, I noticed when you did that and I really appreciated it. Could you also, in this situation, do, you know, whatever it is that you're asking? Not coming in angry, not coming in, you know, swinging your bat, I think will go a long way towards people seeing you as a reasonable person that they can do business with. And I would also say, when I was a staffer, I was always very impacted when I would get a written thank you card after I met with someone. It may be something that they dropped off or could come in the mail, and the mail on the Hill takes a long time because of security. But sometimes I would get a handwritten thank you card from someone I had met with the month before, and it made me remember, and it made me think, wow, these people actually cared about meeting with me, and I should really pay attention to what they're saying.
Jamie, I love hearing these kinds of insider stories, and especially hearing the personal touch that advocates can give to their message. Something as simple as writing a letter really can make an impression and show that you just really have a strong passion towards your issue. So moving on to our next question, obviously in our current day, it's difficult to meet in person, especially on the Hill. Do you have any suggestions for alternative ways that you can stay in contact with your member of Congress remotely?
That's a great question. And in the spring of last year, we had to rethink everything. As a lobbyist, I'm supposed to spend my time on the Hill, and I could no longer do that. So we had to rethink how to stay in touch, like you're saying. And honestly, most of it has come down to video conference meetings, Zoom, Teams, or phone calls. And phone calls can seem a little less personal, but if you follow up, and you can have good conversations over the phone. I often, when I'm asking for meetings, offer a video conference call and then see if they counter with a phone call. And it's just whatever the staffer is most comfortable with. But both of those are still very good options. And sometimes you can fit more of those in a day than an in-person meeting. So I don't think anyone should discount virtual meetings as being less important or less impactful. We're all figuring this out as we go, and those have proven to be still very effective. And then again, following up with email, following up on social media, tagging people, retweeting, thanks, encouragement, why did you do this? You know, whatever your message is, you can stay in touch in a very meaningful way, even if you can't be in person.
I love to think that getting to meet over Zoom or Teams also gives, you know, your representative an inside look into your own life. You get to take a peek into their own home, their bedroom, their living room, and see, like, this is an actual person who, you know, I'm here representing in Washington, D.C., and this is what they care about. So to wrap things up, Jamie, as I've mentioned before, you worked for years on the Hill, and now you're working as a lobbyist for the Susan B. Anthony list. So you've seen both sides of the coin. But what personal examples do you have of either yourself, you feel like you left a really strong impression on your own member, or when you were working on the Hill, what was an experience you had of someone leaving just a really impactful message with you?
I think both from being a lobbyist and being a staffer, the conversations that have really been impactful are the ones where someone isn't just coming in with an ask with no context and just basically saying, hey, your boss works for me, therefore you should do this for me. But the ones that are really impactful are the ones where there's a connection, where you can say, I think probably, even if we don't agree on, the details of this, we do agree on this part of the issue. And you try to build common ground and find sort of the personal element of the thing you're asking. Because members and staff are asked for things all day, every day. What they don't have all day, every day is someone who comes in and says, hey, what would be something that we could do to support you in what you're doing? What are areas that we can work together on things? So that's another ask you can take to a meeting, not just, will you do this for me, but tell me what I as a constituent can do to help you as a pro-life member of Congress or a pro-life staffer. What would be helpful in your district? And also, being a constituent, there are often personal touches that you can bring in, like, I went to the same high school that you did, or, just having different points that bring people together and remind each other, yeah, we're all just people trying to figure this out together, rather than seeing someone as just someone I'm asking for something from, or even as an opponent. So those personal connections, whether being the one lobbying or being the one getting the ask as a staffer, I think those have made the biggest impact on me.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Jamie. It really is just so insightful to have someone with as much experience as you to come on and share just some of the insider baseball of lobbying for life in Capitol Hill. I'm excited to see you and Susan B. Anthony List at the March for Life in just a few weeks.
Absolutely.
And it's just going to be amazing to have you guys join us and for us to join our voices together and speak up for those without one. So thank you.
Thank you, Anne Claire.
Hi there, I'm Tom McCluskey, and I'm joined today with the congressman from Indiana's 3rd District, Congressman Jim Banks, who has been an activist. He's been a state legislator, and he now serves the 3rd District of Indiana in Congress, and also is the current chair of the Republican Study Committee. Thanks for joining me today.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Well, you were a natural choice when we were trying to think of what member to talk to. I have family in your district, as you know, and one thing you're well known for is your constituent services. Why do you and your office see that as so important?
Well, first and foremost, it's a team effort. I mean, I have the very best staff on Capitol Hill when it comes to serving constituents in our district. We make it our very top priority. I have a field staff. They go out to each of the 12 counties in my district and build relationships, hold office hours. And then I have full-time staff in my district office who are devoted to handling issues that constituents have with federal agencies. And just to give you a little perspective we do about 1,400 cases per year. And those include veterans who call and have issues with the VA, or people who call and have an issue with their passport, or much more serious issues than that. Homeless veterans who are trying to find their way into a home to serve them, or individuals that just can't make ends meet and are trying to figure out what pathways for support might be available to them. So our staff did over 1,400 cases this year. The average for a congressional office is about 600. I believe that we've increased that number because we're active, we're out on the road, we're going to the people, not requiring them to come to us, and that's why we do so much more and why we're so good at it.
Well, we get a large contingent of people from Indiana for the March for Life every year. We expect the same again this year. You have been an activist, you've been a state legislator, you've been also, now you're a U.S. congressman. Do you think in those positions you've been affected by grassroots lobbying, especially why it's so important that people in the district should talk to their congressman regardless of if they agree with them on the issue or not?
Yeah, without a doubt. I mean, as you said, I was an activist first. I served on my local Right to Life board. I was involved in local party politics in college is when I became politically active and got connected to Students for Life and college Republicans and other outlets to become an activist myself and learn about this process. And now as an elected official, I see this firsthand. I mean, every single day we get hundreds of phone calls, hundreds of emails, people who post online. Frankly, Tom, I look at too much of it. I look at my social media more than is probably healthy for an elected official, but that feedback informs me on where the temperature is in my district. Ultimately, my job is to represent my district. I can't do that if I don't know the sentiment of those who I represent. So grassroots activism matters. Every year when the March for Life occurs, I know that I have hundreds, if not thousands, of Hoosiers who come to the mall in the nation's capital to make their voice heard. And that inspires me. If I was on the fence, that would affect me. I'm not on the fence when it comes to the issue of life, but it inspires me, it motivates me to do more. It makes a tremendous difference to see that outpouring of activism that comes from my district, from home, to make their voice heard.
Now, you mentioned about social media, and we've talked about this before, about how sometimes the best ways to get hold of a member of Congress, or even talking with their staff, because a lot of times a member of Congress can't know everything. No offense, I know you guys think you might, but you can't know everything, and that's why you have a staff. And sometimes it's better as an activist to talk to the staff so they can better inform you. But on social media, could you share a little insight like you have in the past about how to contact your member of Congress using it?
Yeah, I'll give you some of the secrets. I mean,
if you could.
Every day we get probably thousands of emails at this point. Many of them are form emails. You go to a website, you type in your name and your address, and it generates a form email to your member of Congress's office. Most of those are largely, I don't want to say ignored, because we respond to them in bulk. I will write a response to an issue, and then that will go to hundreds or thousands of people that wrote in about that issue. But I'm probably not going to know your name. I'm probably not going to know that you personally reached out to me. Phone calls that come into the office, some days we get a few, some days we get a lot. And probably every member's office is different. But I have my staff track phone calls, a name, the location of where they're calling. So if I represent Fort Wayne, so it might be John Smith from Fort Wayne, and he's calling to tell me to vote for HR 75. That is all cataloged, and at the end of every single day, my staff sends me a email that's a compilation from calls that go into my district office and my Washington office with the name and the issue that they called in about. So that's, in my opinion, that's more effective than an email. A phone call is more effective than an email. We also get actual physical mail that comes into our office, but we get so much of it, and it has to go through, after 9/11, it has to go through a process where all that mail is scanned because of terrorist issues and people that might send mail that might be could potentially be damaging or harmful. So often I don't get your mail until well after the issue is resolved. But here's the secret, which is what I think you're getting at. I see it every day on the floor of the House. Members of Congress are looking at Twitter. They're looking at social media. And if you are vocal in a tactful way on social media toward your member of Congress, they very well are likely to see it. I see it because often my news stream is what I find online. So when I go online and look at my Twitter feed, I'm seeing what constituents are the comments that they're directing at me about the issues of the day. Now there's an effective way and an ineffective way to be active on social media, and I think the most tactful and wise way is to make your case and do it in a productive way. There are those who are trolls who get on every day that at this point I often laugh them off because they're not effective, they're not wise in how they approach. But oftentimes I see a tweet or a Facebook message from someone who reaches out to me that's winsome, that's effective in a way, and I take that to heart.
Well, I sometimes recommend for people, because after you gave that advice, and I now share that, that include a selfie of yourself, like with a local landmark or something like that at the coffee shop.
That's a great idea.
In the member's district, so that he understands that you are a member. And I'm glad you stressed the civility part of it, because that's what there's a lot to be angry about. but that doesn't mean we need to be angry. That's not who we are. We're happy warriors in the pro-life movement because we know what the end result is going to be. Well, I want to thank you today for joining us. Greatly appreciate it. And more so, I appreciate everything you've done between your service in the armed services and now serving our country in the U.S. Congress and everything you've done for the cause of life.
I'm very proud to do it. These are incredibly important times for all of us to be more engaged and involved. Just the nature of and the uncertainty of where our federal government is leading. March for Life and March for Life Action make a huge difference on Capitol Hill, educating members of Congress about the important pro-life issues. And I know that, Tom, your organization wouldn't be effective if it wasn't because of the grassroots support that you bring to the table. So anything that I can do to support and motivate those who are a part of your organization, I'm happy to do it.
All right. Well, thank you, Congressman.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today, and hopefully you'll also find some time to follow up and to contact your elected officials. Whenever we meet with elected officials or their staff, there's one thing they remember, and that's you, the marchers, in the largest peaceful protest that has been going on since 1973. You are the power behind the March for Life. Hopefully you can take what you've learned today, and to learn more, go to marchforlife.org or text MARCH to 73075. That's MARCH to 73075. Again, this is Tom McCluskey with the March for Life, and I hope to see you at the March.